Welcome to Teaching Truth. On His Majesty's service. That's the overarching theme for our reflections as we unpack the book of Daniel over these coming weeks. And this week we're looking at the sub-theme of Dare to be a Daniel, looking at those qualities which Daniel had in his life and considering what they mean for us. We've already looked at the context of Daniel, the historical context of the book of Daniel. And yesterday we looked at Daniel's culture, his personal culture, and also the national culture in which he found himself. And today in our reflections, we want to come and look at Daniel's courage. Daniel's courage. And we see that in verses 8 to 16 of Daniel chapter 1. You see, although Daniel and his friends had submitted to a new home, a new education, and a new name, there came a point when Daniel effectively said, "This far and no further." We read that Daniel resolved. Daniel made up his mind. You see, for Daniel, this was the hour of decision. This was the fork in the road. This was make up your mind time. And you know, sooner or later in our Christian lives, there comes a point when we need to resolve, when we need to make up our mind, when we need to make a stand for Jesus Christ and be counted. And I believe that looking at the good example of Daniel, the godly example of Daniel, and indeed the example of Jesus, the essence of a true disciple or a leader or anyone who follows Jesus is not whether they are popular. Popularity isn't the thing, but whether, like Daniel, they and we have the principle and the courage to do the right thing, the God-honouring thing. And people will respect us if we have, like Daniel, the backbone to stand up and to do what is right, even if they profoundly disagree with you. When I think of courage, I am reminded of the remarkable story of Pastor James McConnell, who for many years was the senior pastor of the Whitewell Metropolitan Tabernacle in Belfast. And in the book, The Seer's House, the author of that particular book, in a chapter aptly entitled Standing for the Truth, writes this: Pastor McConnell has no other secret than preaching Jesus Christ and Him crucified, and refuses to listen to any other standard of truth. The pastor feels many evangelicals have failed in their faithfulness to the truth. He accepts that preaching other things is good, but believes that the preaching of the gospel is the best. Nevertheless, such a belief has cost the pastor dearly over the years, in that he has lost some of his best friends and colleagues. He has been urged many times to follow, quote, the popular path, but has reluctantly parted company with those who have made these suggestions. To use an appropriate term in Ulster, they wanted him to decommission from the truth, but he has stuck to his convictions and principles and refused to decommission. Some years ago, Pastor McConnell's fundamentalist approach was sneered at on the arrival of what many believe were religious cults. In recent years, however, such an approach has been well and truly justified as his stand for the truth has waxed stronger and stronger. Preaching faithfully in the old Orange Hall, he prophesied that such a trend would develop if men of God left their posts. Sadly, he says, this has come to pass. For him, it's always been the old things, the old landmarks, and nothing less than the blood of Jesus. And for Daniel, it was nothing less than the old landmarks that gave him the courage, the anchorage that he needed. Even in the food that was offered to Daniel, good though the food would have been in and of itself, the fact is that that food would have already been offered to idols. And that is why Daniel and his friends plucked up the courage and refused to eat it. But look carefully and you'll see that wedded to the courage of Daniel is the courtesy of Daniel. Wedded to the courage of Daniel is the courtesy of Daniel. Daniel, in taking his stand, is not giving an impression of being in any way self-righteous or arrogant or brash, not at all. But rather he asks the chief official for permission not to defile himself with the royal food. You see, so often we, unlike Daniel, can say the right thing, but in the wrong way. But Daniel applies innate courtesy and weds that with his courage. And so as we stand for what is right, for godly values and biblical principles like Pastor James McConnell, like Daniel, let's make sure that we do so with a gracious, kindly, and God-honouring spirit. We read in verses 17 to 21 that before Daniel and his friends graduated from the University of Babylon, they had to sit their final exams, and their final exams were oral rather than written. And who was the examiner? Well, the examiner was the king, who we read was impressed by these young men more than any of the others. No matter what question the king asked or what problem the king raised, these four knew 10 times more than any fortune teller or magician. And as a result, Daniel remained at the royal court until King Cyrus conquered Babylonia. How remarkable! How remarkable, a young man in a foreign and pagan culture whose wisdom was sought by the king. And I believe it's because of Daniel's courage, wedded with his courtesy, he found great acceptance with the king. When we step out for God and with God and trust God and stick to our principles, godly principles, biblical principles, and honour him, he often opens doors that, humanly speaking, we could not. And we find that often God grants us favour, as he did to Daniel in the presence of the king. God grants us favour in the presence of even the most unlikely. Daniel's courage. Join me tomorrow as we continue to look at Daniel. Dare to be a Daniel. That's the challenge to each and every one of us, to have those Daniel-like qualities. And tomorrow we'll look at the circumstances Daniel found himself in.